The air in the TWA flight center at JFK used to hum with the electricity of a future that felt inevitable, a future defined by the soaring curve of concrete wings and the deep carpeted silence of a first-class lounge. Today, that same space is a museum, a high-fidelity echo of a time when the red and white globe of World Airlines wasn't just a logo, but a passport to the American dream. To stand within those white vaulted walls is to feel the phantom weight of an empire that once bridged the Atlantic with the precision of a Swiss watch and the audacity of a Hollywood epic. But behind the glamour of the stewardesses in their tailored pillbox hats and the technical marvel of the Lockheed Constellation lay a story of predatory finance, a descent into the cold clinical machinery of corporate raiding that would eventually strip the company to its bones and leave its loyal veterans holding nothing but empty promises. This is the autopsy of TWA, the airline that conquered the skies only to be devoured by the very capitalism it helped define. The origins of this titan were forged in the crucible of early American aviation, born from the forced 1930 merger of Transcontinental Air Transport and Western Air Express. It was known then as TNWA, branded as the Lindbergh Line to capitalize on the heroic aura of Charles Lindbergh, who personally surveyed the routes that would connect New York to Los Angeles. In those early days, the company wasn't just moving people, it was engineering the very infrastructure of modern life. When the 1931 crash near Matfield Green killed football legend Knute Rockne due to wooden wing failure, TNWA didn't just mourn, it revolutionized. They commissioned the Douglas DC-1, an all-metal beast that could fly with one engine inoperative at high altitudes, setting the standard for every commercial aircraft that would follow. This was a company built on the hard edges of physics and the uncompromising demand for reliability, a far cry from the balance sheet manipulations that would eventually define its final decades of existence. Then came the man who would turn the airline into his personal laboratory, Howard Hughes. In 1939, the eccentric billionaire took a controlling interest for $7 million, a move that would inject both massive capital and a touch of madness into the corporate DNA. Hughes didn't just want an airline, he wanted a technical marvel. He secretly funded the development of the Lockheed Constellation, or the Connie, a pressurized triple-tailed beauty that could cross the continent in record time. Hughes was obsessed with the minute details of engineering, often taking the pilot seat himself to test the limits of the LO-49. Under his tenure, TWA expanded its reach across the Atlantic, challenging the monopoly of Pan Am and bringing the world closer together. But Hughes's deepening reclusiveness and erratic management style began to create a culture of instability, a boardroom tension that would eventually leave the company vulnerable to the sharks circling in the waters of Wall Street. The Lockheed Constellation was the pinnacle of piston engine technology, a machine that radiated the sheer confidence of mid-century America. Its graceful dolphin-shaped fuselage was not merely an aesthetic choice, but a requirement for the first truly successful pressurized cabin, allowing passengers to fly over the weather at 20,000 feet. In the 1950s, a TWA ticket was a status symbol, an entry into the Ambassadors Club, where the service was clinical in its perfection and the meals were served on fine china. The technical sophistication of the fleet was matched only by the logistical precision of its global operations. From the hangars in Kansas City to the runways of Orly and Heathrow, the TWA logo represented a gold standard of American industrial power. Yet this high-cost, high-service model relied on a regulated environment where competition was stifled and profit margins were protected by the Civil Aeronautics Board, a safety net that was about to be shredded by the cold winds of change. Nothing symbolized the soaring ambition of the company more than the TWA Flight Center at Idlewild, now JFK. Designed by Eero Saarinen and completed in 1962, the building was a masterpiece of expressionist architecture, its thin shell concrete roof resembling a bird in flight. Inside, the chili pepper red carpeting and the iconic Solari split-flap display boards created a sensory experience of movement and transition. It was a cathedral of the jet age, a place where the act of travel was treated with a reverence that is almost impossible to imagine in today's world of cramped seating and budget terminals. But Saarinen's masterpiece was also a monument to a specific type of corporate ego, one that prioritized grand, permanent icons over the flexible, cutthroat agility that the coming decades would demand. As the Boeing 707 ushered in the era of mass travel, the massive overhead costs of maintaining such infrastructure began to weigh heavily on a company that was starting to lose its financial altitude. The transition to the jet age was a double-edged sword. While the Boeing 707 and the later 747-100 jumbo jet allowed TWA to move thousands across the globe with unprecedented speed, they also required massive capital investments. The debt-to-equity ratios began to swell, and the company found itself in a constant battle with its rivals. By the late 1960s, the Star Stream service and the introduction of in-flight movies weren't enough to mask the underlying fragility of the business model. Then came the 1973 oil crisis, which sent fuel costs skyrocketing and turned the airline's massive, thirsty fleet into a liability. The technical precision that had once been the company's pride was now being strangled by the sheer cost of operation. TWA began to diversify, forming a holding company that included Hilton International and Canteen Corp., a move that was intended to stabilize the books, but instead made the airline look like a collection of valuable parts waiting to be sold. The fatal blow came in 1978 with the Airline Deregulation Act. Suddenly, the protected routes and guaranteed pricing that had sustained TWA were gone, replaced by a brutal, low-cost free-for-all. New entrants with leaner operations began to chip away at the domestic market, while international competitors engaged in a price war across the Atlantic. TWA, with its high labor costs, aging fleet, and massive debt, was caught in the middle. The razor and blade model of selling travel, where the flight was the entry point and the loyalty programs and upgrades were the profit, began to fail as customers prioritized the lowest fare above all else. It was in this moment of extreme vulnerability that the most dangerous man in finance fixed his eyes on the red and white globe. Carl Icahn, the archetypal corporate raider, saw not a legendary airline, but an undervalued pile of assets that could be harvested for a massive, quick turnaround profit. In 1985, Carl Icahn launched his hostile takeover of TWA. He wasn't an aviation man. He was a master of the leveraged buyout, a financial surgeon who looked at a company's balance sheet and saw organs that could be sold to pay for the knife. Despite fierce opposition from the board and the employees, Icahn successfully acquired the airline, positioning himself as a white knight who would save the company from the even more feared Frank Lorenzo. But the reality was far grimmer. Icahn immediately began a process of asset stripping that would define the rest of TWA's life. He took the company private in 1988 in a $469 million maneuver that loaded TWA with over $540 million in new debt while lining his own pockets. The technical assets, the planes, the gates, the very routes that Lindbergh had surveyed were no longer tools for flight. They were collateral for the debt Icahn had used to buy the company in the first place. The most egregious example of this corporate cannibalism was the sale of TWA's crown jewels, the London Heathrow routes. In 1991, while the company was struggling to survive the fallout of the Gulf War and a deepening recession, Icahn sold these essential transatlantic paths to American Airlines for $445 million. It was a tactical retreat that effectively severed TWA's lifeblood, leaving it without the high-margin business travel that had once kept it afloat. To the engineers and pilots who had spent decades building the airline, this wasn't just a business decision, it was a betrayal. The company was being hollowed out, its future being sacrificed to service the interest payments on a debt that it never should have carried. The industrial realism of the situation was cold and unforgiving. Hangars were falling into disrepair, the Connie fleet was a distant memory, and the new jets were being leased under terms that ensured TWA could never actually own its own destiny. The human cost of this financial engineering was borne by the men and women who wore the TWA uniform. To save the company from Icahn's debt mountain, the pilots, machinists, and flight attendants were forced to accept brutal salary and benefit cuts, totaling $300 million a year. These weren't just numbers on a ledger. They were the mortgages, college funds, and retirements of thousands of American families. The TWA lifer was a breed of employee defined by a level of loyalty that is now extinct, but that loyalty was weaponized against them. They were told that if they didn't concede, the airline would die. They gave their sweat and their security to keep the planes in the air, only to watch as Icahn continued to extract value through complex ticket brokering deals that further drained the company's cash flow. The resentment in the cockpits and the galleys was a palpable heavy weight, a psychological decay that mirrored the physical decline of the aging fleet. By 1992, the inevitable happened. TWA filed for its first Chapter 11 bankruptcy.
It was a clinical reorganization that allowed Icahn to exit with a massive profit, while leaving the company a shell of its former self. But even as he left, he struck one final parasitic deal, the Karabu Agreement. This contract allowed Icahn's company to buy TWA tickets at a 45% discount and resell them through his website, lowestfare.com. Every time a customer bought a TWA ticket through Icahn, the airline actually lost money. It was a technical masterclass in asset draining, a business model where the owner of the house is charging the residents to breathe the air. For nearly a decade, this agreement acted as a financial tourniquet, preventing TWA from ever achieving the profitability it needed to modernize its fleet or compete with the new giants of the industry. The legacy of Howard Hughes had been replaced by the ledger of a raider. As if the financial sabotage wasn't enough, TWA was struck by a physical tragedy that broke the spirit of the airline. In July 1996, Flight 800, a Boeing 747-100 bound for Paris, exploded mid-air shortly after takeoff from JFK, killing all 230 people on board. The image of the wreckage being meticulously reconstructed in a hangar, a twisted, charred skeleton of a once proud giant, became a metaphor for the company itself. While the investigation eventually pointed to a technical flaw in a fuel tank, the public relations damage was irreparable. The airline that had once been synonymous with safety and glamour was now associated with fire and failure. The emotional toll on the surviving employees was devastating as they mourned their colleagues and passengers while continuing to work for a company that was visibly crumbling under the weight of its own history and its massive, unserviceable debt. In a desperate bid for survival, TWA attempted to reinvent itself around a massive hub in St. Louis, Missouri. Lambert Field became the last stand of the Red Globe, with the airline operating hundreds of flights a day in an attempt to capture the mid-market traveler. They even began a fleet renewal program, ordering Boeing 717s and 757s in a last-ditch effort to lower maintenance costs and improve reliability. For a brief moment in the late 1990s, there was a glimmer of hope that the airline could recover its former glory. The new Global One livery was sleek and modern, and the service began to reclaim some of its legendary polish. But the damage done during the Icahn years was too deep, the debt was too high, and the Karabu deal continued to bleed millions of dollars in potential revenue every single month. The company was running a marathon with a lead weight tied to its chest, and the finish line was nowhere in sight. The final act began in 2001 as the dot-com bubble burst and the travel industry faced a massive contraction. TWA, already on life support, filed for its third and final bankruptcy. The end was not a bang, but a cold, calculated transaction. American Airlines, the very company that had bought TWA's London routes a decade earlier, moved in to acquire the remaining assets for roughly $2 billion. It was a deal of convenience. American wanted the St. Louis hub and the remaining TWA gates to fortify its own empire. For the TWA employees, the merger was a final indignity. Seniority lists were merged in a way that left many TWA pilots and flight attendants at the bottom of the ladder, effectively ending careers that had spanned decades. The Airman's Airline was being swallowed by a corporate machine that had no room for the nostalgia or the heritage of the red and white globe.
The true tragedy of TWA's death wasn't found in the boardrooms of Dallas or the courtrooms of St. Louis, but in the living rooms of its retirees. As the company was liquidated into American Airlines, the health and life insurance benefits for tens of thousands of retired workers were unceremoniously terminated. Men and women who had spent 40 years servicing engines and navigating the globe were suddenly told that the promises made to them in the 1960s were legally void in the 2000s. The Bankruptcy Code, designed to save companies, was used as a weapon to strip the most vulnerable of their security. This is the human cost of the legacy brand downfall, the slow, painful erosion of the middle-class dream that companies like TWA had once helped to build. The precision engineering of the past had been replaced by the precision legal maneuvers of the present, and the workers were the ones left in the wreckage. Today, the TWA legacy exists in a state of suspended animation. The Saarinen terminal at JFK, once abandoned and covered in the dust of neglect, has been restored as a high-end hotel. People now pay hundreds of dollars to sit in the sunken lounge and sip cocktails where passengers once waited for the 707 to London. It is a beautiful, meticulously curated ghost of a past that no longer exists, a sanitized version of a history that was actually defined by sweat, oil, and the brutal reality of financial warfare. The red and white colors are vibrant again, but the soul of the airline, the collective pride of its workforce, is gone. The hotel is a monument to what we lost, a place where we can visit the glamour of the jet age without having to acknowledge the predatory forces that eventually ground the airline into the dirt. The story of TWA is a cautionary tale for the modern age, a reminder that even the most iconic brands can be dismantled if their value is reduced to nothing more than a series of numbers on a spreadsheet. It was a company that lived and died by the vision of powerful men, the obsessive engineering of Howard Hughes, and the cold-blooded raiding of Icahn. Between those extremes, a generation of Americans built a world-class institution that defined how we see the world. But in the end, the technical brilliance of the Lockheed Constellation and the architectural genius of Eero Saarinen were no match for the leveraged buyout and the asset strip. TWA didn't just fail because of bad luck or changing times. It was systematically dismantled for the benefit of a few, while the many were left to watch the red globe fade into history.
As the final TWA flight, Flight 2, landed in St. Louis in December 2001, the water cannons of the airport fire trucks created a ceremonial arch of triumph that felt more like a funeral shroud. The pilots, many with tears in their eyes, taxied the MD-80 to the gate for the last time, ending 75 years of aviation history. The logo was painted over, the uniforms were boxed away, and the red carpet was rolled up. The infrastructure of an empire was absorbed into the beige corporate identity of American Airlines, and the name TWA became a footnote in the history of the 20th century.
But for those who remember the sound of the Connie's engines or the feeling of walking through the Saarinen tunnels, TWA remains the queen of the skies, a reminder of a time when we aimed higher before we learned how to profit from the fall.
The clinical autopsy of TWA reveals a terminal case of financial mismanagement masked by a glorious past. The razor and blade model of aviation was broken by deregulation, but it was the internal bleeding caused by corporate raiding that truly finished the job. The company's death was a choice made in boardrooms, a series of maneuvers that prioritized short-term extraction over long-term stability. The $540 million debt, the Karabu ticket deal, and the sale of the London routes were the precise instruments used to kill the patient. What remains is a brand that evokes a powerful nostalgia, a longing for a time when American industry felt solid and its promises felt permanent. But the rusted hangars and the terminated pensions tell a different story, a story of how easily an empire can be unmade when its leaders stop looking at the horizon and start looking at the bottom line. In the end, the red globe of TWA stands as a warning to every legacy brand that still survives today. It is a reminder that excellence in engineering, architecture, and service is not enough to protect a company from the sharks of finance if it loses control of its own narrative and its own debt. The silence of the TWA Flight Center is now filled with the voices of tourists, but the ghosts of the Airman's Airline still linger in the corners of JFK and the memories of the thousands who were left behind. TWA didn't just fall from the sky, it was brought down by the very hands that claimed to be saving it. As we look back at the golden age of flight, we must recognize that the most dangerous turbulence isn't found in the clouds, it's found in the cold, clinical pages of a leveraged buyout agreement.